There's so much talk about cholesterol out there. And what I find is most social media posts, influencers, even doctors, they're always talking about LDL and VLDL and HDL. And in reality, those numbers are useful, but they're kind of like the numbers we use since the 1980s. There's better markers out there that we have, and people need to shift the conversation to the better markers so there's less confusion.
Well, hey everyone, Dr. David Perlmutter here. Welcome again to the Empowering Neurologist. There's a lot of talk these days about some emerging therapies like exosomes and peptides and the use of these GLP-1 drugs, cryotherapy, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, sauna therapy, hormone replacement therapy, etc. And these really are leading edge therapies that we might encounter, for example, if we were to become involved in a longevity clinic, a leading edge longevity clinic like Next Health. Next Health is such a clinic. There are 8 of them now, and they were started by Dr. Darshan Shah. Dr. Darshan Shah is our guest on the program today, and he's going to explore these ideas with us. Let me tell you a little bit more about him. Dr. Darshan Shah is a health and wellness specialist. He's a board-certified surgeon, published author, entrepreneur, and as mentioned, he's the founder of Next Health, the world's first and largest health optimization and longevity clinic. As a longevity medicine specialist, he has advised thousands of patients on how to optimize their well-being and extend their health span as well as lifespan. He began his career in an accelerated MD program, earning his medical degree at the ripe age of 21 years, becoming one of the youngest doctors in America, and continued his medical training at the Mayo Clinic. He always has been involved in continuing his education with a degree that he earned from Harvard Business School, Singularity University, and other prestigious institutions. His passion is speaking on the topics of longevity and health, having done so over 100 times around the country and indeed around the world. He's a good friend, and I'm delighted to welcome him to the program. Well, hello, Dr. Darshan Shah. Welcome to the program.
Such an honor to be here, Dr. Perlmutter. This is a long time coming. I love it. Thank you for having me.
Well, I think we're going to pick up our conversation where we left off last time or the time before, which was on your podcast. And then as I had the opportunity to visit your clinic in Los Angeles, I really enjoyed looking around. And so let's take a step back. And, before you started with the clinics, what got you interested in the notion of longevity and health span? How did that all come about from what you were doing before?
Yeah, so in my previous life as a surgeon, I was deep in Western medicine, kind of like you were. And I kind of had this revelation after I went through my own personal health struggle with multiple medical problems like autoimmune disease, high blood pressure, metabolic syndrome, high visceral fat, all the bad things all combined, just, the traditional chronic disease milieu that we see many of our patients in right now. That was me. And when I found that my Western medical training could not help me reverse chronic disease, it was definitely really good at covering up the symptoms with pharmaceuticals, I thought there had to be a better way. And so, I think a lot of people look at me as a longevity doctor, but in reality, my introduction to longevity came from trying to add more healthy years back into my lifespan. So it's more about living a healthy life rather than adding those years on. Now, that's a great side effect of feeling healthy and being healthy. Obviously, you're a perfect example of that, for example. But I would say that it's through that lens of reversing chronic disease, which has a side effect of just feeling great, that I approach longevity.
Well, we're going to spend some time, really unpacking a lot of these kind of new innovative therapies that Next Health offers. But you were really, I think, in bad shape. You were kind of getting ready to crash and burn. And how did that work out? You spoke to your colleagues, or what was the epiphany for you? How did you make the shift?
Yeah. I almost feel like I did I was in this kind of a slow motion crash scenario when I made the shift. And so the epiphany to me was I saw some of my colleagues. Some of them were very famous doctors in Beverly Hills, concierge medical physicians. And I saw them and I was just prescribed more medications. I was not
Really?
given no advice on, or not even a question about what am I eating? How am I sleeping? What are my stress levels like? That was not even part of the conversation. And I think the revelation there to me was, look, medicine is going to continue to evolve and create more pharmaceuticals, more surgical therapies, more high tech services to manage the symptoms of this chronic disease epidemic. But in reality, what we need is a new way of looking at chronic disease from the root cause. And that's where I picked up Disease Delusion, was the book by Dr. Bland, our friend Dr. Bland, and really shifted my mindset. And I mean, that book and the thought process around functional medicine that you teach as well really changed my life. And so I was able to reverse chronic disease, stop all my medications, and stop the slow motion car crash that I was on at that moment in time.
So that kind of exactly where I wanted to take our conversation. So here you are, steeped in your surgical career. You're really, you're trained and you're all excited, but your health is starting to deteriorate, and you realize there's other things that you should be paying attention to. So what does a guy do at a time like that? Let's say if you're talking to the next Darshan Shah, who's going to be a crackerjack surgeon, but his health is falling apart. Where do you go to suddenly embrace these other ideas, and then well before implementing them, where does one go to learn about this stuff and really open up one's mind?
Right. So when I got into this, it was about 12 or 13 years ago. And, we now live in this age of education that's kind of all around us. There's a tremendous number of podcasts and online courses and conferences that you can go to about this. But back then, people were just starting to talk about this. But I'm a big believer in lifelong education and lifelong learning. And so anytime I have a problem that I don't know how to approach it, I look and find education. So the first thing I did was I found that book. Then through that, I discovered the Institute of Functional Medicine. And I actually went in my most unhealthy state. I went to the IFM course, and immediately during that course, I made massive changes in how I approached health and how I approached health and my own chronic diseases. And so from that moment forward, I think I was just living the lifestyle myself. And so it was through education and learning that I was able to create changes. And those same changes, I always look at learning as this process where it's a process of taking in information, applying it to yourself or applying it to real world scenarios, and then talking about it and teaching it to somebody else. That whole mental reprocessing loop of education. That's what I did. I was talking to all my patients about how to get healthy. I would see a ton of overweight patients in my surgical clinic, and they would ask me, like, what are you doing? And I said, hey, let me tell you about, how sleep improved my weight, how addressing my metabolic disease improved my weight. All these things kind of work in concert, and talking to my patients about it and them seeing changes as well is what really gave me the notion that this is something that the kind of medicine I wanted to practice. And so incorporating that from just the beginning of whenever I talk to a patient rather than it never being a conversation made all the difference in my medical practice.
So it really was a Dr. Heal Thyself moment for you, and it wasn't a situation that we so commonly see. It's do as I say, not as I do. So you were really walking the talk, and people were starting to take notice. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the more you did this, the more you realized that a lot of what is going on around us, and certainly in your patient population, is induced metabolic issues based upon lifestyle choices. So I guess that sort of fanned the flames. When did you transition then away from being a surgeon to focusing on utilizing these ideas in a practice?
Yeah, so it's pretty much immediately after, I took some time off to go to these conferences. I decided that moment that I wanted to do something new. And, I had to have a job to pay the bills. And I had a pretty big surgical practice at that point in time, lots over 100 employees. So I had to continue doing surgery. But what I did was I started my first clinic in, West Hollywood, California. It was a small 1,000 square foot office that was completely separate from my surgical practice. I wanted to make sure that
Interesting.
that I had a separate space to practice this because I didn't want to conflate the two. And so people would come and see me at this separate clinic, which we called Next Health, for specifically just health optimization. How do I get healthy again? How do I reverse chronic disease? And it was in that small little practice that I was starting to see patients. And then we got so busy, I hired a PA and she started seeing patients. And then it just kept growing from there.
So I had, a similar situation. I was in a very big, busy mainstream neurology practice, and I decided to put on a different hat, like you put on a different hat, and then ultimately this became your full time job. And so here you are now in the Next Health, first Next Health clinic, and you're wearing your new hat, and ultimately you shift over there. So, who did you bring on? What kind of other help did you bring to the Next Health Clinic early on?
Yeah, so it was just like setting up a brand new practice. Early on, I had nurses and office staff, and we quickly saw that people were getting healthy. And, it's pretty amazing how quickly this stuff works. I mean, this stuff can work in 6 months to completely reverse someone's uh, health status to where they're feeling great again. And we got busy enough that I needed a physician's assistant. So I had a physician's assistant join me and a nurse practitioner. And from there, we just added more doctors and more locations. The one location didn't cover it, so we added another location in Century City, which is a few miles away from West Hollywood, a third one in Studio City, which is a few miles away from there. And every location has a physician overseeing it. Every location has a physician's assistant as well, multiple nurses at every location. So it's a real medical clinic. Like it's not just it's not just a recovery lounge or an IV lounge. It's a real medical clinic. And even though we do have a lot of those therapies that can augment your journey, we take a medicine first approach. We do a full evaluation of people. We physically exam, we do blood biomarker testing, and we sit down and we create a plan for people that addresses their specific needs that's fully personalized to them.
But let's draw some broad strokes if we can. What are the
Mhm.
main things people are getting wrong when they first walk in that door? Not when they've been treated, but what are they getting wrong that's making them sick?
Yeah. I think a few things that I see as very common themes is number one, most people have no idea about what's going on in their own biology. They have completely outsourced their health to their primary care doctor. And the first thing they say, I say, how are you doing? Well, my primary care doctor said I'm doing fine. How does he or she know that? Well, I come to the office once a year for 30 minutes and they do some blood work, I think, and they measure my blood pressure and they say I'm fine. and and that's pretty much all the information they have. They have no idea of what their biomarkers are showing them. They don't know what their skeletal muscle mass is. They don't know any of that information. And so I think that's mistake number one. I really try to empower people to regain that control of their health, understand what those numbers mean, become the boss of their own biology. Their doctor is just one part of the team that they need to establish to help them on this journey, but no one's going to care more about your health than you do, right? And so really empowering them to understand what are those numbers, what do they mean, and how much control they have. Secondly, I would say is I see a lot of people majoring in the minors. Everyone wants to know about the latest and greatest supplement. What about the latest and greatest technology? What can they do to kind of shortcut their health journey? And I try to reframe it completely for patients that all of these technologies that we have on site, these supplements, all these other things that you hear about that, Brian Johnson is doing, for example, or Dave Asprey, like that's all great stuff for you to know about. But number one thing is you got to get the big rocks in place first. You got to focus on the 20% of the information that makes 80% of the difference before you attack and the long tail of items, the rabbit hole that you can go down on health and wellness, right?
I think that's true. And as you mentioned, Brian Johnson. I mean, if you watch his new movie, the number of therapies that he's engaging is breathtaking. Including some that are interesting, if not perhaps threatening, and yet one wonders what the motivation is. But I think you said 20% of the things that we do really represent 80% of the benefit that we're going to get. So the big pieces. So we'll get to those, but let's go back a little bit to the fact that you're looking at various biomarkers.
Right.
And Lord knows there are countless laboratory tests available, everything from genomics to epigenomics to metabolomics, proteomics, looking at the microbiome, et cetera, et cetera. But what are the big players that people need to be paying attention to who may not be able to get a soup to nuts kind of evaluation? But what are the big things that even their doctors could do for them?
Right. And I think you said this, the key phrase there is even their doctor could do these. These are all blood tests that are available to everybody. They should ask their doctor for them. And if their doctor says no, it's time to start looking for another doctor or just, give them the information they need to understand why these are valuable. So they've kind of fallen into a few major categories. One is metabolic health. I think everyone needs to understand a few key biomarkers of metabolic health, markers such as serum fasting insulin level.
That's the first thing
level.
You said was
Right.
serum fasting insulin level.
Yes.
Let's stay there for just a moment.
Yes.
Why on earth would I want to know my fasting insulin level?
Because that's going to be the first thing that changes when you go down the pathway of metabolic disease. That's the first sign that you're developing some indication of metabolic disease in your standard blood chemistry.
But doctor, my blood sugar is normal.
That's the last thing that's going to change. And that is so variable over time. And unless you're wearing a continuous glucose monitor, you're not going to really get the resolution that you need with just one serum glucose level. And so it's, your body is working overtime, making insulin to keep that glucose level normal. So it's the last thing that's going to change. It's the insulin that goes up first.
It's funny because 15 years ago when I was writing Grain Brain, actually after it was published in 2012, I didn't list a bunch of tests to get. I listed some things like A1C, homocysteine, and fasting insulin. And the pushback that I got from my so-called colleagues, are you an endocrinologist? Why do you care about insulin? And I think what you just explained is so important, that this presages it predicts the ultimate rise in blood sugar once insulin is really not doing its job and it's raised its level significantly, trying desperately to keep that blood sugar under control. So it's very much a predictor significantly in advance of what that blood sugar is going to do. And yet it's not part of a general examination even these days. And what's it going to take? You got to wonder. So people need to get a fasting insulin. What's next on the list?
Yeah, and just to highlight that, I mean, it's enigmatic of Western medicine, right? Like the number that most Western medicine doctors or primary care doctors use is hemoglobin A1C. And we use it because that's the indicator that diagnoses you with diabetes. When you have a hemoglobin A1C over 6.5, you get diagnosed with diabetes.
But 6.4, everything's great.
Right, exactly. But why do we wait until the end of the last thing that will change to make a diagnosis? Well, because now we can prescribe you something, right? But the first thing that changes is insulin. Sometimes by 20 to 30 years before you get diabetes. Sometimes even in adolescence or even childhood is when you start seeing high fasting insulin levels. So it's incredibly important to highlight this.
Well, hi everyone, Dr. David Perlmutter here. We hope you're enjoying this content, and if you would do so, go ahead and hit the like button. And if you're not already a subscriber to our channel, please consider doing so. We're really grateful to have you as part of our community, so let's get right back to the presentation. And you mentioned a continuous glucose monitor. Is that pretty standard for you to be using something like that in your practice?
Oh, it's more than standard. I shout it from the rooftops. I think everyone needs an experience with a continuous glucose monitor. It's a piece of technology that we've been using for diabetics for, almost a decade now. And finally, we can use it for people that don't have a diagnosis of diabetes. And so it's available over the counter, and people can get incredible resolution on what their body is doing with food and how their body is metabolizing and making energy. So yes, it's universal that we have all of our patients get it. So how are you feeling about the notion that
as you and I have this conversation today, kind of a revolution has happened in that people are being empowered with a level of knowledge that they never could get before because it was sequestered by the medical professional. I mean, now people can go to Function Health and have a massive panel of blood studies ordered without a doctor being involved directly, and can get it, as you mentioned, a continuous glucose monitor. How do you feel about that?
I feel it's the best thing that's ever happened in the history of our medical journey through the last 5-6 decades. I think it was a huge disservice to our population that the data was gatekeepers had access to your data, and they not only the only people that had access to your data, they're the only people that can even get you the blood work. You could not get a blood panel without a doctor's order. And so that gatekeeper mentality led to, I think, the massive rates of chronic disease we see today.
You could walk in and get an MRI scan now without a doctor. You could just go in and get insurance may not cover it, but you could just probably get, I don't know how far it goes. I don't know. I mean, you can't go and get cardiac cath perhaps, but you could get an awful lot of stuff these days. And, I've always said as it relates to the CGM, and there's still pushback from physicians saying no, patients shouldn't have that data because they don't know what to do with it. My argument is, well, then by that logic, people shouldn't be able to buy a bathroom scale, right? What are you going to do with that data?
Exactly.
So we covered the fasting insulin test, and we covered the use of a continuous glucose monitor. From a blood test perspective, what's next on the list?
Okay, the next thing is understanding how much inflammation is going on in your body. And there's a few key biomarkers there: HSCRP, uric acid, also homocysteine levels. I like to have people have a few different angles to look at inflammation, and so they understand if they have inflammation going on in their body and what they can potentially do about it as well.
Well, it's interesting that you segued from looking at your metabolism vis-a-vis the insulin and the A1C and the CGM monitor and went right to inflammation. What's the relationship between our metabolism and inflammation?
I mean, as we know, metabolic health is the root cause of almost every chronic disease. And add to that the body's ability to fight these diseases with usually your immune system. Your body is using its immune system, and inflammation is the marker of that. Inflammation and chronic inflammation is what is another root cause of all of these diseases, and they're incredibly interrelated. People with poor metabolic health have a lot more inflammation than people with good metabolic health. And the combination of the two factors together is what leads to atherosclerosis, leads to liver disease, leads to all the things, kidney disease, all the things that we see together.
You mentioned homocysteine, and you also, we'll get to uric acid in one, but you mentioned homocysteine. What is that, and why do I care?
Yeah, so homocysteine is another marker of inflammation that's been incredibly well studied as its relationship to heart disease, and specifically, cardiac heart attacks and cardiac events. And so it's a risk. It's one of those biomarkers that's been shown to be very well correlated to heart attack, but because it's not just heart attacks, it's all organs are being affected when you have a high homocysteine level. One specific factor to understand about homocysteine is that it's usually people that have a problem metabolizing their B vitamins that have high homocysteine levels. So someone should be looking at their intake of B vitamins and their methylation of B vitamins if they're having a trouble with their homocysteine levels being high.
And you can sort of predict then who's going to have homocysteine if you are doing genomic profiles.
Like MTHFR is one gene that can predict high homocysteine levels because that's a defect in your methylation pathways. One of the few defects of your methylation pathways.
So homocysteine is something people should really be paying attention to. The next thing you mentioned is something called uric acid. And that's kind of a new player on the block, isn't it, in terms of getting this panel done? Why uric acid?
Well, it's new, but you wrote a pretty great book about it, so that's
another
great.
Be the best interviewer I can be here.
Yeah. So once again, uric acid is another great biomarker, and I like to look at it as it's a waste product basically that's produced, and a waste product of a specific type of molecule called a purine. And so uric acid matters because when you have high uric acid, it can lead to diseases like gout and kidney stones, but also it's one of the main contributors to metabolic disease as well. And people with high uric acid levels also have other problems like high blood pressure, for example, or other cardiovascular issues. So it ties into a lot of chronic diseases again, and it kind of goes hand in hand with metabolic disease.
I'm really glad to hear you say that. I mean, that was the reason I did what I did, is so that we would recognize that there are some pretty well-defined pathways that relate elevated uric acid to hypertension and to dysglycemia. And, we understand why this happens. And it's very heartening to hear now the number of people who are forward thinking like yourself, who are looking at uric acid and then helping people make the changes that they need to, such that they can reduce their uric acid and help them reduce the signaling of these pro-inflammatory pathways that are so destructive with respect to metabolic health. And so, anything else on the top tier list of laboratory studies?
Yeah. So the next one then is markers of atherosclerosis. And so, there's so much talk about cholesterol out there. And what I find is most, social media posts, influencers, even doctors, they're always talking about LDL and VLDL and HDL. And in reality, those numbers are useful, but they're kind of like the numbers we use since the 1980s. There's better markers out there that we have. And people need to shift the conversation to the better markers so there's less confusion. And so what I mean is I look at ApoB almost exclusively with people. ApoB is a protein marker for all of the, I'm doing air quotes, bad forms of cholesterol, whether it be LDL, VLDL, et cetera. But also it takes into account a form of cholesterol that we have not talked about, and definitely needs to be a lot more conversation around it, because 15 to 20% of people have this, is a high LP little a. And so LP little a has been basically missed by the medical establishment for decades. And we know that it's a genetic form of hypercholesterolemia that is particularly virulent because it can cause early heart attacks, early strokes in patients. And so if you have a high ApoB, but your LDL is normal, I always go looking for LP little a.
So it sounds to me that your lipid workup goes well beyond just looking at what most, I think, mainstream clinicians do, and that is, we're going to look at your total, we're going to look at your LDL and your HDL, as if LDL is bad and HDL is good. And if the ratios are not good or the total is high, then onto a statin you will go. So how does that play out for you?
Yeah. So my explanation of atherosclerosis and heart disease to patients is it's a combination of three factors. It's not just your cholesterol levels. I actually don't even care what your LDL level is for the most part. I want to know, yes, do you have, in general, many forms of bad cholesterol that could potentially lodge themselves in your arterial wall? ApoB will give me that. However, it's not just high cholesterol that causes heart disease. You need to have inflammation. So we're looking at inflammatory markers and damage to your blood vessel wall. How does damage to your blood vessel wall happen? Metabolic disease, and anywhere on the spectrum of metabolic disease, even hyperinsulinemia, hypertension, and high stress levels. Those are my three main reasons people see damage to the endothelium or the blood vessel wall. Fourth reason is overtraining as well, which we see a lot of athletes. We see a lot of people with damage from that too.
Yeah. Okay. So I've at one point developed a little atrial fib and went to the cardiologist, and he said, well, in your case, with your vessels being in good shape, it's the kind of thing we see either in NBA players or people who did a lot of long distance running. Well, I'm not going to ever be an NBA player, nor does my physique lend itself to that. But I, overtrained, had to do marathons and had to have low times, and not always the best thing. And people ask at this stage, now that I'm an elder statesman, what's the message for the younger individuals? And I would say, take it a little easier. Don't push so hard. Gosh, so many of us pushed really, really hard. Any other top tier lab studies that you'd like to talk about?
Yes. So I would say those are my three major buckets. But then the fourth bucket I dive into with people is the status of their hormones. And so I think this is something, again, no one checks hormone levels with their patients for the most part, unless you go to a functional medicine doctor. And, I think we've done a major disservice to the last two generations because we've kind of vilified hormone replacement therapy or even looking at hormones as a potential indicator of health or dishealth. And I'm a big believer in trying to get people to look at how to optimize their hormone levels. Now, it doesn't always have to be hormone replacement therapy, but I also think that we need to take away some of the stigma and the fear around hormone replacement therapy as well.
Well, I think let's talk about men for a moment, and that takes our discussion to testosterone. I think that when we do look at a free testosterone level and look at serum hormone binding globulin, et cetera, and total testosterone, I think there's probably a bit of confusion and perhaps even some fear. You brought up a stigma, mentioned that just now. But so where does a male stand on the idea of testosterone replacement in juxtaposition to prostate cancer risk? Because we know that in prostate cancer, one of the treatments is is using a drug to block the conversion of testosterone to its active form, 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. So there's always this fear that, if I use more or raise my testosterone level, it might increase my risk for prostate cancer. How do you handle that discussion?
Right. So it's not an increase of the risk for prostate cancer, is that if you have prostate cancer with testosterone receptors on it and you're giving yourself exogenous testosterone, that will stimulate that prostate cancer. However, we know that having a normal testosterone level can actually protect you from all forms of cancer, and prostate cancer being one of them. So obviously, we're going to monitor you and make sure that you don't get a prostate cancer developing while you're on testosterone replacement therapy. We do that with the PSA level as being one test that we can use. However, I try to encourage my patients that I think that this whole conversation about prostate cancer got derailed about 30 years ago. And I say that because I used to do prostatectomies in my general surgery career. And way too many people had their prostate glands removed for a high PSA level on a possible prostate cancer. And we now know that many, many men develop prostate cancer. Probably near 50% of us or even more will develop prostate cancer in our life. These cancers are extremely slow growing. They occur late in our life. And many of them develop because of metabolic syndrome combined with chronic inflammation, combined with, poor metabolic health and low hormone levels. And so if we can protect you from prostate cancer in the first place, let's do it. Let's get your metabolism right. Let's get your testosterone levels good. Let's reduce your inflammation, all of that. And so that's kind of how I reframe prostate cancer for people.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's been said that for men, you'll either die from prostate cancer or with prostate cancer. So what would then be an indication for a man to want to use a testosterone replacement therapy?
Right. So I like to say to my male patients that what was your testosterone level when you felt your absolute best in life? For most men, that's somewhere around their mid to late 20s, early 30s. Unfortunately, most men have never had their testosterone levels measured at that age. So we don't know what the number is. So I tell people, look, your number is different than John's number, which is different than Bill's number. So don't worry about the number, right? So I say, we need to focus on symptoms. What are your symptoms? So we have many different symptoms of low testosterone. And it's not just, erectile dysfunction. There's many symptoms that we need to see if this is a picture of low testosterone. And then we go by symptoms and we go by free testosterone, which you measured, not total testosterone, because of the amount that's bound to sex hormone binding globulin. So it's really just a symptomatic conversation. And if, you could tell when someone has low testosterone, they have brain fog, they're tired all the time, they have kind of a little bit of a beer belly, they can't put on muscle. It's a combination of different things. And so that's how we guide our therapy.
And how do you replete it?
we give different options. I'm not a big fan of the testosterone gel creams because I've seen very variable absorption, but there are forms of testosterone that I like. There's injectable testosterone that people should do at smaller dosages more frequently throughout the week. There is pellet therapy, which I personally use myself, which I really like because it's more convenient, especially I'm traveling a lot. And so it's hard for me to remember my injections. But there's also now oral testosterone replacement therapy available as well, which is extremely well tolerated. And people are looking at that as kind of a first line therapy. Now, if you are of childbearing age and you still want to have children, none of those really work for you. Instead, you should think about using a drug like enclomiphene, which stimulates your natural production of testosterone. And this all comes after doing all the other things, meaning getting your metabolic health right, lifting heavy weights, taking creatine, all these things that we need to do to increase our natural production of testosterone.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit. There's a lot of talk in your world, and I'm not going to call it the biohacking world, but you're on the edge of looking at new and exciting technologies. And one of the things that is always talked about is something called peptide therapy. Maybe you could walk us through a little bit what that even means and what are a couple of the peptides that, if you're using them, may be helpful and things that people could consider.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned peptide therapy. So I do want to highlight here, Dr. Perlmutter, that, the way I try to get patients to approach their health, and specifically some of these cutting edge therapies like peptides, for example, is we talked about it earlier. Let's get the big rocks in place and let's get everything else right before we do things like peptides. So this is kind of I have this model called the wellness wheel that I think I've shown you, where we first start off with lifestyle medicine and then preventative medicine and then functional medicine, and longevity medicine and things like peptides come last. Now, with that being said, because we've been doing this for 10 years now, we have a lot of people that have done everything right. And now they're seeking these additional treatments. And so peptide therapy can be a great adjunct. Peptide therapy is one of the first kinds of drug therapy that are available. Insulin is a peptide, and we've been using insulin for decades. And so since then, humans have discovered many, many peptides. The latest one being Ozempic, GLP peptides. These are all proteins that are naturally found in our body that exert some sort of physiological signaling. And when you have peptides, you're actually replicating a biological signal versus a pharmaceutical or a drug, which is a chemical that's exerting an effect. So I actually like peptides. I feel like peptides have very low risk of complication compared to pharmaceuticals, and yet they have a lot of different biological effects that we can utilize in our medical practices. Now, that being said, peptides don't have a lot of research behind them. So a lot of research still needs to be done. Some of the peptides that we're using very successfully are BPC 157, body protection compound 157. It's a natural occurring peptide in our gut that actually helps heal joints, heals cartilage, heals muscle tissue, heals gut tissue. Really good for gut health issues and for people post-surgical or post-injury. We also use CJC 1295 in combination with ipamorelin, which has been used to boost growth hormone, a natural production of your own growth hormone versus people taking growth hormone. And same kind of patients as well, people that are healing from surgery, healing from injuries. And, there's a few others that we're looking at with our patients as well.
But by far and away, the biggest peptide category around are the GLP-1 agonist receptor targeting drugs. Where does Next Health stand on the use of GLP-1s?
Yeah. So, I think it's important to highlight that before Ozempic and these branded GLP-1s came out, we were using GLP-1s in our functional practice for years. These are compounded by pharmacies. We knew they had a fantastic effect at helping people that are refractory to dietary interventions get their metabolic disease under control. And so whenever we had someone that we tried everything we could to get their hemoglobin A1C normalized and it didn't work, we would use semaglutide. And it worked great. And people would lose visceral fat, their hemoglobin A1C would come down, they would, their brain fog would lift, et cetera. So we have a lot of experience with GLP peptides. And now that there's kind of a spotlight on them, we are seeing a lot of patients come to our clinic that want them. Now, our stance on them is that number one, you should only take it if you have an indication for it. So if you're trying to lose 10 pounds for, the Oscars party that you're going to, that's not an indication for GLP-1. We measure a full blood panel beforehand. We see where you stand on the spectrum of metabolic disease, inflammation, etc. And we have a very mindful process. Our other secondary there right now as well is that we always have a goal in mind with our patients. We say, look, let's pick a goal, whether it is skeletal muscle mass, fat mass, hemoglobin A1C number, whatever it is, let's pick a goal. And then we have an offboarding program. So this is very important because I think I think, there's too much talk around people being on GLP-1s forever. There's a very low percentage of our patients at Next Health. I would say maybe 5% of patients that are on GLP-1s for more than 6 to 8 months. It's really a low percentage because we have an offboarding program that combines the ability to mindfully get off GLP-1s once you've achieved your goal with us helping you restore your natural production of GLP-1 as well. So that's kind of how we look at it, big picture.
So how difficult is it for these people then to transition off of semaglutide or other GLP-1?
Yeah, it's for our patients, it's not that difficult because we, from day one, we're educating them on how to use this time while they're on the GLP-1 to reframe their relationship with food. So the reason people have a hard time getting off GLP-1s is because they're eating the same foods, whether they're on GLP-1 or not, just less of them, right? They're still eating pizza, burgers, French fries, soda, just less of it. And then that's what they go back to afterwards. And that's going to lead to obesity again. And so for us, we use a time to get them on a higher protein diet, organic diet, lots of vegetables as well, good monounsaturated fats, and a good supplement program as well to supplement their nutritional needs while they're on the GLP-1, but also to recreate the microbiome to help them produce their own GLP-1 again. And so, there's a microbiome called Akkermansia that helps us make GLP-1. And most people have no Akkermansia left in their gut due to ultra-processed foods and due to pharmaceutical agents, basically. And so we help them reform Akkermansia as well as their microbiome just in general.
So what kind of numbers can we look at in terms of people who that you treat with GLP-1s lose the weight and can't come on? I mean, how successful are you in keeping people from having to return for another round, or how does that work? What's your success rate?
I would think that we probably have about 5 to 10% of people that end up either not coming, either getting back on it or not being able to go on it, which is pretty low. I mean, if you look at the studies that the pharmaceutical companies are putting out, they're saying everyone needs to stay on it forever. And
why wouldn't they say that? Exactly. That's a surprise.
That's not a surprise, right? Exactly. But I really feel that, that there is a way off of these. It comes through education, reframing your relationship with food, and reforming your microbiome and re-educating yourself.
You're talking about the microbiome and the role that it might play in satiety, for example, and with reference to signaling, et cetera. I wonder what kind of research is actually looking at the changes in the microbiome related to the use of these drugs. Be something I think when we're done, I'm going to look at. I want to move back just a little bit to some of kind of the other novel things that you're doing, and I think you're using exosome therapy.
Yes, we do exosomes as at our clinics. Mainly IV exosomes is what we're using right now. And just for your audience, exosomes are the vesicles inside of stem cells that exert the effect that stem cells have in healing areas of our body that need healing, whether it be whether you're injured or just even from chronic disease.
And what is the source of those exosomes?
So we get our exosomes from a lab that we've actually visited in the Midwest, in Kansas City, Missouri. And the source comes from, they're purified from human umbilical blood products, basically.
And so do they amplify the cells and then extract the exosomes and ship them to you?
Yes, they amplify the production of the exosomes within the cell, and then they extract them from the cell. They're not amplifying the cells themselves.
I see. And do people have any negative reactions to exosome therapy?
Honestly, I've never seen that. I think the ones I've heard about in the news basically are people that are using either stem cells or exosomes from another country. And I think it's mostly from storage issues, transportation and storage issues. I mean, these are cells. They will grow in medium, and so will bacteria grow in the same medium. And so if you are not storing and producing these in a really controlled environment, there's a high chance that you're going to get either toxin or even bacteremia from it. So it's really important to source these well.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that your clinics offer is the intravenous administration of NAD. And let's walk through why that might be, a good thing to consider, what the indications might be, and then talk about, if you can, what your response has been, what your success has been.
Yes. So we do intravenous NAD, and we also do intravenous nicotinamide riboside, which now I'm a much bigger fan of. NAD is the precursor that our mitochondria in every cell use to make ATP, which is basically the currency of energy in every cell. And sadly, we live in a highly stressful, toxic environment, and our cells just don't make ATP the way they used to. Also, as we age, we know that our mitochondria make less ATP and we have less mitochondria. So the more help we can give them, the better, by giving them the substrate they need. NAD is given intravenously. We usually give 750 milligrams intravenously. And it takes some time because that NAD actually gets converted to nicotinamide riboside before it gets absorbed into the cell. And so it hangs out in your bloodstream, and that causes kind of a reaction that people have, a kind of a chest pain, a nausea. And so the slower we give it, that usually mitigates for it. So, sometimes it takes 3-4 hours. What I found to be even more beneficial is IV nicotinamide riboside that gets directly absorbed, and then you don't have that side effect. And so that's not my new favorite way.
When I had my NAD injection at Next Health, I always like to get things done. And so I reached over when no one was looking, opened up that IV wide open. And I'm kind of sorry that I did that because right. I see where you're coming from. You also have cryotherapy at Next Health. Tell us why that's so exciting. We're hearing a lot about that.
Right. So, I think cryotherapy is a form of cold therapy. So, for years, athletes have been using the cold plunge in their gyms and their training facilities. We've been doing that for decades and decades. And that works really well to reduce inflammation. That's why they do it. Also, as a state change, it creates endorphin release. It brings your blood into your organs, like your brain and your heart, versus your periphery for a few minutes. And all of that is helpful. Cryotherapy is just a more comfortable way of doing it. So you don't have to be in water for a long time. Instead, you're in a cold air chamber, and people can tolerate it a lot better with the same effects. And so I'm a big fan of cryotherapy, and we actually have what we call the longevity circuit. So it's one of 4 devices that we have people come in and do kind of in a circuit row over the course of like an hour and a half.
What's next on the circuit?
So we start with hyperbaric oxygen therapy, actually. So we do a 45-minute hyperbaric session in anywhere between 2 to 2.4 atmospheres of hyperbaric oxygen, depending on what we're going after. After that, we put people in the LED light bed. That's 20,000 LED near infrared lights. And then after that, we do a sauna session. So everyone knows what a sauna is. We use an infrared sauna, and then we do cryotherapy last. So you end up feeling like $1 million after doing those 4 in a row.
So, what is the response of what you're doing at Next Health? I know that the public is loving what you're doing. How do physicians look upon, your leading edge approach?
Yeah, it's, one of 2 ways. I think physicians that, thank God we have physicians that are incredibly well trained in Western medicine. We need them to take care of us when we have a heart attack, we get diagnosed with cancer or Alzheimer's or any of these diseases. But, I think that we need to tie traditional Western medicine with this new kind of medicine that is a combination of functional medicine, chronic disease reversal. And that's the real key. And more physicians are recognizing this. So we have partnered with probably over 100 physicians in the LA area that refer us patients to partner with them to help reverse chronic disease and to make their patients feel healthier again. And these physicians love it because number one, they don't have the time or the resources to do it anyway in their clinics. Number two, insurance doesn't pay them to do it. So they're not getting paid to do this stuff anyway. And so having this partnership with our local concierge doctors and just primary care physicians in general, we're right next door to One Medical and they send us patients as well. And so we work really well hand in hand now. So I'm really encouraged in seeing the reception amongst physicians, and a lot of our patients are physicians as well. And so we are filling a hole that's been left in healthcare, right? Healthcare is really disease care, right? Right now. Yeah, I think we're filling that hole, and more doctors are recognizing it.
I was told when I first opened my clinic so long ago that by the group I was in when I left, that great, follow your dream, but no one in town is going to refer to you, and they were right. My referrals started coming from outside, but the doctors who still wouldn't refer to me became my patients and would refer their families. But as far as referring any other patients, that didn't happen for a while anyway. One of the obviously interests of mine, and I think you're touching upon this as well, is cognitive decline as we age. How does the Next Health Clinic approach that?
Very proactively. As we know, our brain is the most resilient organ in our body. It takes we have so many more brain cells, unfortunately, than we use on a day-to-day basis. And we have a lot of extra mileage that we can get from our brain while we're creating damage. And so, I think giving our patients that realization that they need to start taking care of their brain now. And by now, I mean, even in childhood, exposing your children to less traumatic brain injury, contact sports that can cause brain injury over and over and over again is incredibly important. And then as we get into our 20s and reducing exposure to drugs and vaping and those kind of things. And then our patients, mostly in the, I would say, mid to late 30s, all the way up to their 50s. And during that time, it becomes extremely important to address metabolic disease, address inflammation, address hypertension. So it's a constant piece of our conversation that most of our patients haven't even thought about. They don't feel cognitive impaired. They assume that it'll never get there. But in reality, the damage builds up over time, as we well know.
Yeah, and I think what they are led to believe is that when it happens, then we have great drugs that'll just fix it. Off you go, as if that were reality. As we wrap up, let me ask you, pin you down a little bit. What would be the one practice, the one health-related practice that you have engaged that's had the biggest impact on your overall health and sense of longevity?
Yeah. So for me, it's really been the morning routine. And so that's kind of a cheat to your question because I do a few things during that routine. But I would just say, just conceptually, health is really not just individual practices you can do. It's the habit of even doing one thing right day after day after day. And so if you can become an expert at forming habits in your life and breaking apart bad habits, but definitely forming new good ones, you will win this game. And so I submit to all my patients that number one, before you do anything, learn how to form habits. And so my optimal time of forming or executing on a habit is first thing in the morning. No one else is awake. I have my time. I have my full mental energy with me. And at that moment, I can focus 45 minutes on myself. And so it involves a few things stacked on top of each other. And habit stacking is one of those skills that I think, everyone needs to master. But start off with going outside every morning. I have my supplements every morning. I put some creatine in my coffee. I do some breath work. I do some journaling, and then I go straight into a workout and I end it with that. And that's 45 minutes. And it's a game changer for me because that done day after day after day leads to massive change in my physiology.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, hey, man, thanks for spending time with us today. I hope I can get to your birthday party, by the way. That should be exciting.
I would love that.
Darshan, tell people where they can learn more about you.
Yes. I'm on social media, of course, at Darshan Shah, MD, and my clinical practice is at next-health.com, and my website is drshah.com.
drshah.com. Well, great. Good to see you again. I think we saw each other last at Eudaimonia, I think, right?
Eudaimonia,
Perhaps?
right? Exactly. And I think I'm going to see you at IHS next week, right?
Oh, I am going to be there. Correct. Yeah, that's
Yes,
right. I'll
I
see you in
can't
New
wait to
York.
see you.
Awesome,
Can't wait
man.
to see you.
Thanks for spending time with us. You're the best. And I hope to see you. I'll see you soon. Yeah. Bye for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perlmutter.
Well, we learned a lot today, didn't we? We explored everything from exosome therapy to peptide therapy to using cryotherapy and hyperbarics. But I think the main takeaway is that work by Dr. Shah and others really lets us understand that we are the architects of our health destiny. We're really in charge of where we're going to go in terms of our health span, in terms of remaining healthy as we age, physically and cognitively, and fundamentally as that relates to the choices we make each and every day and how those choices influence our metabolism as measured by the various biomarkers that we talked about today. So really interesting work that Dr. Shah is doing. Again, Next Health is the name of the clinic. Really grateful that he joined us here on the Empowering Neurologist today. We will be back soon. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.